ready?
Yep. All right, this is a continuation of appeal number 2023-01. This is our third meeting. I do want to just start off by, I did receive an email or a message from Attorney Spadoni's office asking that his motion to recuse, or at least it be acknowledged that he had filed this motion to recuse Mr. Manzi. Nothing has changed, I assume, Mr. Manzi?
What's that again?
Nothing has changed?
Nothing changed.
Okay.
Warmer weather.
Yeah, exactly. But I think we can start. Mark, I think you're still up. I know there was another individual who wanted to claim party status. I mean, if you want to come up and just identify yourself, your address, where you are in relation to the proposed project site.
Okay. My name is Joe Tripoli. I live at 65 Sunrise Boulevard in Mount Bethel. And we have the 122-acre preserved farm on the corner of Sunrise and Potomac.
What was the address again?
I'm sorry?
What was the address again?
65 Sunrise Boulevard.
Okay, and where's that in relation to the project site? Right next to
Right
it?
across the street from
No objection? I assume no objection from the other side?
No,
Okay. You'll be granted party status.
Thank you.
Tripoli.
Joe Tripoli.
I assume it's Tripoli?
TRI.
Okay.
The letters that I get from you guys, the certified letters to be here, have my wife's name also on the letter. So do you need both names on
No,
there?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Is there anyone else that we've missed that would like to claim party status before we move forward? Okay. All right.
So I have two witnesses tonight, Joe Valentine, our soil scientist, and Jeff Clark, our hydrogeologist. We'll start with Mr. Valentine, who's sitting here to my left. So,
Raise your right hand, please. You do solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Okay.
What, just before we get started, can we just swear in everybody that's party status? Just please swear them in now, as opposed to doing it later. Anybody that's gonna claim party status, please just stand and be sworn in. Well, unless you're represented.
Raise your right hand. You do solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Okay, and could everybody give their names so we know who
Yes, please.
stood and, Mr. Angle? Ron Angle, okay.
Jeff Joy, J-O-Y.
Thank you.
Frank Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Clark.
Joe Tripoli?
Okay.
Laura Wolcott,
And
W-A-L-C-O-T-T, first
Thank
name
you.
is Laura.
You have that?
I got you. I did. I will never forget you, Ron.
Ms. Walcott, you're at 74 Summerfield Drive, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
It's on.
could you state your name? Oh, okay. Could you state your name and the business address for the record?
Joseph A. Valentine, VW Consultants, Canary Road, Quakertown.
And I'd like to show you a document which has been pre-marked as Exhibit A16 and ask if you recognize this document.
Yes, that's my resume.
And is this an accurate statement of your academic and professional qualifications?
Yes, it is.
I'd like you to expound upon that. Could you describe your educational and professional background for the board?
My undergraduate degree is in biology, 1974, from Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Subsequent to that, I went to Delaware Valley College to obtain soil credentials, which completed that coursework in 1983. Work experience, I started in 1975 with the Bucks County Department of Health, worked there for 11 years. Was environmental protection specialist and promoted to the soil science position after obtaining the credentials to be a soil scientist. After my regulatory experience, I moved on to consulting. I was with Del Val Soil Consultants from 1986 to 2011. Subsequent to 2011, I worked as a sole proprietor for 2 years and then started another company called BW Consultants in 2013 to the present.
Could you expand upon your time at Del Val College and give us a little bit more detail about your experience, your studies, and your expertise?
So I've been an adjunct soil instructor at Del Val College, now university, since 1983. Approximately in 1990, there was an RFP published for research that was going to be funded by the Department of Environmental Protection. So my company, Del Val Soil Consultants, in conjunction with Delaware Valley College, pursued that RFP, and the grant was awarded to the college. So for a period of about 10 years, from 1992 to 2002, on-lot sewage systems were installed full scale on the college property and evaluated for their impact to the environment over a 3-year period in phase 1, and then for a second 3-year period in phase 2. It was during that research that drip irrigation was one of the systems selected along with a number of other alternatives. But I'll speak to the drip irrigation part of it. It was that research done at Delaware Valley College that provided the information to the Department of Environmental Protection to allow the use of drip irrigation for permitting by a sewage enforcement officer for individual on-lot sewage systems. Phase 2 of that project, we continued on with larger scale evaluations of drip irrigation for a small community system and beneficial use of that drip irrigation. It was with that information then DEP considered drip irrigation as an alternative for larger volume systems such as community systems that we're talking about here tonight.
Joe, when you say they considered drip irrigation, you mean they considered drip irrigation as a methodology to discharge treated effluent?
That's correct. So the purpose of the RFP was to identify 6 technologies utilized elsewhere in the U.S. or the world, select those technologies, install 3 full-scale installations on the college property, and monitor their performance in phase 1 for 3 years, and in phase 2 for an additional 3 years. Speaking to the drip irrigation, we did monthly sampling of the effluent that was being discharged to the drip system, and also as it passed through the soil profile at depths of 1, 2, 3, and 4 feet beneath the ground surface. And that sampling regimen included a number of things, from fecal coliform to fecal strep, to the nitrogen series, to phosphorus. And monthly sampling occurred, and then a report was provided to the department. It was based upon that report that DEP decided that that technology could be then issued by SEOs for permitting on-lot sewage systems.
So that was, if I understand it right, that was an alternative to stream discharge?
Well, it was an alternative to other technologies that currently we were using at the time in Pennsylvania, such as elevated sand mounts. That was really the alternative to the drip irrigation. Could you have other technologies that could be a substitute to an elevated sand mount?
Mr. Valentine, am I correct that there is no licensing procedure in Pennsylvania for a, quote, soil scientist.
That is correct.
So tell us about your experience, your memberships, your professional credentials as it relates to recognition as an expert in the field that we're talking about here tonight.
The employment qualifications of the soil scientist for DEP and for county health departments follows the federal guidelines of a soil scientist that would work for the NRCS. That's the agency that does the soil mapping in the U.S.
Say that without, what's the name of it in full words?
United States Department of Agriculture Natural Resource and Conservation Service, formerly called the Soil Conservation Service, SCS.
And how long have you been practicing as a soil scientist?
Since 1983, initially with the Bucks County Health Department.
And by whom are you employed now and in what capacity?
I'm a partner in a company called VW Consultants. My job responsibilities are evaluating soils for all-lot sewage, evaluating soils for hydric soil conditions and determining wetland conditions, evaluating soils for stormwater recharge.
You might have just answered this, but could you explain for the board your job duties at VW Consultants?
I manage two other soil scientists. In addition to that, I have an engineering training and a recent graduate of Delaware Valley University who will become a soil scientist after 5 years of experience.
And what do you do personally?
I personally still go into the field, that's where I was today, evaluating soils for, as I mentioned before, individual on-lot systems or larger volume community systems.
Excuse me, Mr. Kaplan? Joe, can I ask a question? I just got a little confused on something. Do you
Well,
mind?
let me
Go
do
ahead,
with my
go
next
ahead.
question and then, sure.
Yeah, I just
So I would offer Mr. Valentine as an expert in soil science and land application of wastewater to soil in Pennsylvania. And I ask that he be accepted as an expert. And if you've got questions, please.
Joe, I just wanted you to clarify something. You, Mr. Kaplan, you asked him about his licensing before. Joe, what does qualified soil scientist mean? Like, who qualifies you?
Okay, so in Pennsylvania, there's an organization called the Pennsylvania Association of Professional Soil Scientists. DEP recognizes that organization, and full members of that association are deemed qualified soil scientists, which in Pennsylvania is required for evaluating sites for alternate systems such as drip irrigation and what we call shallow limiting zone alternate systems when the limiting zone is less than 20 but greater than 10. So in Pennsylvania, you still have to have the SCO with you to confirm the limiting zones, but you have to have a qualified soil scientist to assign what they call the loading rate.
Which is almost in lieu of a licensure, as close as we can get to a licensure with the
Well, that's correct. PAPS has tried for years, going back to 1975, to get licensing in Pennsylvania.
Spell that out without the acronym.
Pennsylvania Association of Professional Soil Scientists has tried on numerous occasions to get licensing, and I'll say this nicely, the political climate isn't such to have another license in Pennsylvania.
I got it. So basically, could we say that you're board certified by the board of whatever Pennsylvania?
Like PAPS,
Yeah.
correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for augmenting my qualifications. Thank you. I would renew my request that Mr. Valentine be accepted as an expert and offer him
Any
to
objections?
Mr. Blasey for any questions, or Adrian, to you for any questions.
No, I don't have any objection. I his qualifications as an expert.
Thank you.
party status have any objection to him being qualified as an expert?
Okay. Mr. Valentine, were you here for Mr. Ebert's testimony on February the 27th and March the 18th?
Yes, I was.
Why were you retained by the applicant in this case?
The initial engagement was to identify potential parcels that would be feasible for land application of wastewater. Our initial task was to look at approximately 10 different tax parcel numbers, do what I call a preliminary evaluation, where we would go out with a backhoe, dig test pits on the property, and evaluate the conditions of the soil, effectively looking for the depth of bedrock and depth to seasonal high water table, either by direct observation or by presence of a soil condition called redox features, which is a gray color that occurs in soils after prolonged saturation, not just a day of rain, but prolonged saturation. So based on that preliminary evaluation, which is basically a mapping job, we identified the most potential area for land application of wastewater. And one of the criteria that obviously we were charged with was that there was a certain size that we were looking for. At that point, it was 200,000 gallons a day. We also were looking for a contiguous area, because when you land apply wastewater, it becomes more challenging to manage it if they're separated by miles. And so the preliminary evaluation identified the Angle property as having the best soils for land application of that amount of wastewater, and also had the best contiguous soils that were suitable for land application.
And Mr. Valentine, during his testimony, Mr. Ebert identified applicant's exhibit A13 as a hydraulic conductivity report. Could you look at A13 and tell me if that report was prepared by you or under your direction?
Yeah, the report that you're identifying is dated November 4th, 2022. That is a report that was signed by Matt Hostrander from my office. It was under my supervision, the actual field testing that was done in concert with that. And in writing the report, I reviewed his information to confirm the validity of the conclusions.
And were you retained by the applicant to test the soil in various locations, including the Angle farm, to determine the capacity of that soil to sustain land application, drip irrigation for wastewater disposal? And I apologize if that's a repeat to what you just told us.
So as I testified before, we evaluated 10 parcels initially to identify the best potential area for land application. The Angle property was settled upon, and there, at that point, we did additional preliminary testing of that property to refine the suitable soils. And that involved, again, digging test pits. Initially, we just did some preliminary test pits here, there, and everywhere. Now we were zeroing in on this area that ended up to being about 22 acres. Subsequent to that preliminary, more detailed preliminary evaluation, we then scheduled the confirmation testing with the Department of Environmental Protection and the Township Sewage Enforcement Officer, Scott Policelli. On that date, we opened up test pits around the perimeter and through the area that proposed a drip irrigation land application. Approximately 45 test pits were evaluated with the Department of Environmental Protection and the Township Sewage Enforcement Officer to confirm the suitability of that area based upon the soil morphology. And when I say soil morphology, I'm talking about the depth of bedrock and the depth of seasonal high water table. Then subsequent to that, similar to an individual lot, we have to measure how water moves through the soil. On an individual lot, we would do what's commonly called a perk test. Hydraulic conductivity is a more sophisticated way of measuring water movement through soil, but similar to a perk test. So we ran 28 hydraulic conductivity tests across this area of land application. The area at that time was much larger than what was finally settled in on. Because of buffering requirements and the other issues, the initial area that we evaluated with 28 hydraulic conductivity tests was reduced in size to the 22 acres. So in that 22 acres, we had 11 hydraulic conductivity tests that were utilized to determine how water moved through the soil.
You just answered my next 5 questions, thank you.
Mr. Kaplan, are there diagrams showing this in this big binder? I don't see anything.
Look at Exhibit A13. That's Joe's report.
Is that figure 4 and figure whatever it is?
For diagrams of test pits.
I'm looking for, I'm not looking for the test pits, I'm looking to show where, I wanna see where the bedrock is and, where the, just the nature of the soil itself. Is there a meta diagram of that?
Well, there's, I'm gonna pull this closer to me.
Go ahead.
Would that be this one? Sorry,
I think there's like 3 together. Let Joe find it.
okay.
So you're looking at a plan.
Yeah, I'm looking, on tab 11. And again, I'm ignorant to this, so I don't have a clue what I'm looking at, man. The first chart, at page, tab 11.
Let me try and keep this on track. We'll answer all of your questions.
All right, I just wanted to see what I was hearing.
Joe, I'm not quite sure.
I could try to answer his question here.
Well,
if you'd like.
you'll do better than I will, sure.
So there is a plan that shows where all the test pits were located, okay, and where the hydraulic conductivity tests were located. I believe it's a larger scale plan, maybe towards the front of the report.
Okay,
Okay, so you have to open
Give
that.
me a second.
and,
Fred, is one of the other reports or one of the other plans, what?
It shows the locations. I think what he's asking for is a soil profile, which is part of the planning module, and it's submitted in there. I don't believe that was reproduced in the exhibits.
okay, so is there a global profile of the entire site?
When you say the entire site,
The entire,
the Angle property,
beyond the Angle property, where the buildings are and everything? Is there a global soil profile of all of it?
well, that's way beyond what we're talking about here.
I asked that because I'd like to get an idea of, have we tested the soil globally on the property or just in the Angle property?
Well, I'll come back.
Okay, do I
So
have that? figure?
I just technically, sir, I want it understood that our application tonight is to do drip irrigation on the Angle property. That's all we're here about.
Why are we doing drip irrigation on the Angle property?
Because we
To
need
support the other property.
well, that's not what the ordinance
I
requires.
understand, but I'm just trying to get a picture in my head of the entire area. So I'm not trying to be combative.
I'm going to try and get an answer, but may I ask you for what purpose?
I'd like to understand the profile of the soil in the entire area. Only because it gives me an idea of where the rocks are, where the sand is, where the different profiles of the land is. Out of my own curiosity.
Okay, that's fair, okay.
And
Jeff,
I don't need a specific, I'm not looking for anything super specific. I just wanted to get a general idea.
Well, maybe we can answer that. Joe, come back to,
I don't wanna waste our time, you know, we've got a lot
okay,
of stuff to cover.
I have a question that may help you. Mr. Valentine, one question that was asked of Mr. Ebert was whether or not RPL considered using its existing industrially zoned property for wastewater disposal. What, if any, consideration did you give to RPL's roughly 700 acres? Is that the question that you want?
Kind of. Just, what is it, Joe? Answer his question, please.
Well, as I previously testified, back in the initial engagement of VW for this site, we had approximately 10 different tax parcel numbers that we looked at. Of those 10, 4 were located in the industrial zoned area.
So in the 700 acres from RPL?
Correct,
Okay.
correct. We did not evaluate at that time all 700 acres. They were specific parcels within that 700 acres, 4 of them, including 6 additional ones outside of the industrial zoned area. It was based upon that testing that the Angle Farm had the most consistent, suitable soils for land application. And I think what you're asking, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you say a profile, that means something to soils people. When a profile is a vertical section of soil.
Yeah, you're talking depth, I
Okay.
understand.
You're thinking more of an aerial extent of where the suitable soils are.
Exactly.
Okay, and so, you know, and then we didn't get into this this evening, but obviously we consulted soil maps first. But soil maps are at a scale, generally, that a mapping unit would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 acres.
Okay.
So when you do detail testing, whether it's for an individual system or a community system like this, you have to have a much more refined map. And that was the purpose of the preliminary evaluation, to do that kind of refined reconnaissance, to find out, based upon what's literally at the site, which of those 10 tax parcel numbers had the better soils.
I understand, and we're talking, of course, in terms of the drip irrigation. And again, I'm thinking of, well, we're putting a whole bunch of buildings in here over this large site, so we need to know where the rock is, we need to know what we're setting these footings on.
I'm sorry, but that is way, way beyond this.
Right, and we have not done that yet.
Well, we have preliminary approval of land development of an entire subdivision for the 700-800 acres. We have all types of testing. We have preliminary approval for 13 or 14 land development sites that significant testing has been done for a variety of purposes. And at the time that there will be applications for building permits, there will be geotechnical investigations for exactly the issues that you're talking about. What kind of footings, where they are. I don't want to shut you down at all, but that's way, way
I
beyond
understand.
where we are
We haven't
tonight.
gotten there yet. So what we're establishing now is that the Angle property is face value the best place to put this field.
Well, I'd say more than face value. I'll let Joe characterize it himself, but we've done enormous testing in there, and Fred Ebert testified to all the testing. Joe Valentine, Fred Ebert, and our hydrogeologist, Jeff Clark, who will testify afterwards, have worked as a team for as long as I can remember to identify proper locations for septic systems, on-lot systems, disposal, etc.
Yeah, I understand, and I'm not questioning their qualifications.
No,
I'm stupid, so I'm allowed to ask stupid questions. But
I like that, Pat.
there you go. Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
I don't want to shut you down, trust me, I want you to get the
Well,
information.
I understand.
I would just prefer, if we can ask the questions afterward, let's get through the testimony. We will be here till God knows, next Christmas.
Joe, I guess I cut you off. So you testified as to why you picked the Engel property. I believe you testified to what you did, and I think we were about to get to your report. So let's go to, I'm gonna go back up a little bit, just so everybody can get it, because Rob and I tried to break this down in little pieces so that it would be understandable. So you picked the Engel property as the best property, and then you, and I'm just gonna give you the first sentence of it, please tell us what you did. You dug test pits, is that correct?
That's correct. So, in picking the Engel property, I'd rather say the soils picked me, okay? The soils at that site were more suitable for land application, and again, in a large area. We didn't have little pockets, so some of these other parcels that we evaluated had suitable soils, but they weren't large enough in extent to accommodate a large volume system that we were proposing. And so, to simplify this, and I think I've already gone down this path, but to reintroduce it, the Engel property was selected because it had the most continuous, suitable soils for land application. We then went in with backhoe pits and evaluated the morphology, describing the soils to the depth of bedrock, to the depth of seasonal high water table, classified the soils, texture, the structure. With that information, as I mentioned before, we set up confirmation testing with the Department of Environmental Protection and the Township SEO, where 45 backhoe excavated test pits were evaluated by all those personnel.
Let's go one step farther. You had a backhoe test pit that was how wide, how long, and how deep?
Okay, usually there's a 2-foot bucket. The backhoe pit is usually dug to at least 40 inches. And in order to get into the hole, there's a ramp that's excavated. So the dimension of this test pit would be 2 feet wide and probably about 10 feet long. The deepest part of that test pit would be approximately 40 inches deep.
Okay, now you got it, you go down the ramp, what are you looking for?
I'm sorry, the depth was what, 4 to 8 feet?
40 inches, a meter.
And what were you doing when you got down into that test pit?
Identifying initially a limiting zone. The limiting zone is either seasonal high water table by direct observation or the presence of soil mottling, which is an old term, we now call it redox features, or limited by bedrock, either shattered rock with no soil in between.
I'm sorry, either what, Bob?
Shattered bedrock, with no soil in between, or massive bedrock. Once that is the depth classes and the drainage classes. So for land application of wastewater, we generally want to have soils that are at least moderately deep, that means at least 20 inches to bedrock, and are at least moderately well drained, meaning they're 20 inches to a seasonal high water table. The deeper the bedrock and the deeper the redox features or indication of seasonal wetness, the better the soils are for land application. So the area of the Engel farm that we are applying wastewater to have soils that are at least moderately deep or 20 inches to bedrock or 20 inches to seasonal wetness. In many instances, they were 40 inches plus to both bedrock and seasonal wetness. The soils at the Engel farm are weathered from glacial till, material that was brought down during the last glacial advance, and are placed on top of the existing bedrock there, which is a shale material.
So the first part of this, if I understand, is you're looking at the profile of this soil and saying that if we put water down on that soil and it drips through there or it irrigates through there, is it going to be stopped or is it going to be contaminated by what's there? Is that accurate?
Well, I would say that the purpose of the evaluation is simply to ensure that we have sufficient depth of soil to allow for the renovation of wastewater. Now, in the case of an on-lot sewage system, we're asking that soil to do that renovation. In the case of this application, we're using highly treated effluent, so we're really just trying to disperse the water through the soils, and the soils would be some final polishing that might occur with renovation.
So this is not a septic system?
That's correct.
Okay, so now you've determined all that. Now, you then did another set of tests, something called hydraulic conductivity.
Hydraulic conductivity. So that measures what's called the saturated K value, which is how quickly does water move vertically through the soil. Pennsylvania DEP requires us to identify, based upon that test pit, the most limiting horizon that the morphology indicates that would be restricted to drainage. So these depths to this hydraulic conductivity vary depending upon the morphology of the site. So we would pick the denser part of the soil profile, and we would run these hydraulic conductivity tests. Those tests basically are inserting a pipe into that horizon, bentonite seal the annular space.
Say that again.
Bentonite sealing the annular space, the space between the hole and the pipe.
Is sealed with bentonite,
Sealed with bentonite.
sort of like
So-
some kind of cement.
It's a clay. It's an expandable clay. And that prevents the water from only going straight down the pipe and not out the sides. So we're measuring vertical flow through this dense horizon.
Okay. Now, could we go to your report? Could we look at page 3 on your report and tell us where the test pits and the results of the test pits summarized in the large chart on page 3?
Yes, so I'm referring to our report, that's in binder tab 13, and the report dated November 4th, 2022. And on page 3 is a spreadsheet identifying the 28 tests that were conducted. It gives the depth of the test, the depth of redox features, the depth of rock, the depth of groundwater, the permeability test depth of the test we ran it, and the actual results, the hydraulic conductivity rates.
Now, if I could ask you to go over to the next page in your report, and there's a smaller chart. And could you tell us what the smaller chart is?
So as I previously testified, we initially had a much larger area, much greater than 20 acres that we were considering for land application. But due to buffering requirements, that area was trimmed back to the area that we're proposing, the 22.4 acre site. Then we utilized just the hydraulic conductivity tests that were done within that area. We initially looked at all the data, but that data actually had a faster hydraulic conductivity rate if we used all 28 tests. So then we looked at just the tests that were done within the application area, which had a slower hydraulic conductivity rate, and that's the data that we used.
Okay, so could you tell us about the results in the smaller chart, in the chart on page 4?
Okay, well, again, it reports the same information that it did on the preceding chart. The summary, if you look down into the narrative below, it gives you some information. So if you look at the last paragraph in that report, it really summarizes the approach that was taken. So in Pennsylvania, when we do hydraulic conductivity testing, we come up with a number. we're only allowed to use 10% of that measured value to apply wastewater to. And so of those 11 tests that we were utilizing, we came up with an average value of 54 plus inches per week that could be applied. The 10% value of that is 5.47 inches per week.
Let me understand that. Let me understand that. What's the 54? What was that? How was that derived?
Based upon the actual hydraulic conductivity number obtained at this site, theoretically, 54.67 inches per week could be applied to that soil
Of water.
of water.
Okay. But you don't use that total amount. You're limited by DEP regulations or whatever. So even though it's shown to be able to absorb 54 inches of water a day or a week or whatever it is, you're limited, and your report reflects what?
The report reflects, first of all, utilizing only 10% of the measured value, which then would be 5.47 inches per week. However, in soils in Pennsylvania, we generally do not apply wastewater exceeding 2 inches per week. So to start off, the measured value was 54.76. 10% of that number is 5.76. But best management practice would only use 2 inches a week. So the hydraulic conductivity test performed here was to confirm whether or not we could apply at least 2 inches per week, or should it be less. Our findings indicated that we could apply 5.47 at a 10% measured value, but we reduced it back to 2 inches per week as required by best management practices.
And that's what you reported back to Mr. Ebert for his calculations and Mr. Clark's calculations.
That's correct.
Mr. Kaplan, I think Mr. Blasey had a quick question on this point.
I think it would be helpful if you reference the page in the report where that's discussed. I think I find it, but I don't want to be
It's the
presumptuous.
4th page.
It looks like to me on the 4th page, it would be at the bottom. I see the number of 54.67. Is that the location of this discussion?
That is correct.
And if just going forward, Mr. Kaplan, if we maybe would reference where we would find it in the report. that would
He
be
did.
helpful.
He did. He did, all right.
Mr. Valentine, based on your investigation and the results of the testing that you performed, what conclusions did you reach with respect to the capacity of the soil on the subject property to sustain land application, drip irrigation for treated wastewater disposal? And again, I apologize if that's a repeat to what you've already testified for, but I'd like to hear your opinion in one place in this record.
So based upon soil criteria and solely soil criteria, depth to bedrock, depth to seasonal high water table, measured hydraulic conductivity, verifying that it was actually greater than the best management practice of 2 inches per week, this site is acceptable for land application of wastewater. But there's other chapters to the story, and those chapters deal with the hydrogeologic issues that Mr. Clark will be talking about. So a large volume system like this has a number of different steps that we take to determine the suitability of the site. I just had the portion dealing with soils. I might add that at this point that Mr. Ebert gave testimony previously that he actually reduced our 2 inches per week to a lower number based upon his position and experience using soil morphology as the limiting factor. And his testimony said that based on the depth to bedrock and the depth to drainage, he assigned the numbers which were less than the measured hydraulic conductivity, which were less than the 2 inches per week that we determined would be adequate. And based upon Mr. Ebert's testimony and how he approached it, which was his best management approach with his experience, that 2 inches per week has been reduced on average to about 1.2 inches per week.
So your study, Exhibit A13 is your study. That was submitted with Mr. Ebert's planning module to the Department of Environmental Protection and used in the design that was described by Mr. Ebert for the overall system.
That's correct.
I know this is redundant, but let me get it in. In your opinion, are the soils of the subject property able to appropriately support the proposed drip disposal system?
Yes.
So from your perspective, Mr. Valentine, is there any reason to believe that the land application of the highly treated wastewater that Mr. Ebert described, using drip irrigation disposal at this site, will have a negative impact on the public health, safety, or welfare?
No, there shouldn't be any impact with a properly operated drip irrigation system. And in fact, this particular site with the high-quality effluent should have less impact than the neighboring on-lot sewage systems that are not pre-treated, using just septic effluent.
So you bring something up that, I'm sorry, I didn't ask before. So you were out there. There's farming going on out there? On the
Yes, it was active in agriculture.
And what's used, what's put on the ground to help the farming?
Well, there's usually fertility tests that are done to determine how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium needs to be applied depending upon the crop.
So there are, tell us what you would think would be normally spread on the property to augment the growing.
I don't object to this. I mean, it's just beyond the scope of his submitted expertise in this. He's a soils expert, not an agricultural expert.
I mean,
He's out there. He knows what was put on the ground.
The objection stands. I mean, he's here to testify, and his report does not mention anything about what was put on the ground. Mr. Kaplan's been very clear to limit his testimony to how the soils are on the Angle property.
did he do any testing of the soil itself? Like as far as
Well, it
the
did
components?
a lot of testing.
But as far as the components? I mean, if he had personal knowledge of it, why wouldn't he be able to testify about that?
I don't get it. He's got personal knowledge. I asked him if he knows what was being put on the ground.
He's an expert, and an expert usually testifies within the scope of their report. And so, again, I don't see anything within the scope of his report, so my objection is
The rules, if you're right, the rules of evidence don't apply, and this witness has got personal knowledge.
I'll overrule it. I mean, I think it's relevant.
Joe, can you answer the question?
So normal agricultural practices, perhaps not on a yearly basis, but on a 5-year basis, would be to take soil samples and to determine what deficiencies are in the soil. pH, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Those are usually what are tested for. Depending upon the crop, the Penn State Guide to Agronomic Guide would give recommendations as to how much pounds per acre of N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, needs to be applied to optimize the crop yield. In addition to that, this is a no-till site, so since it's no-till, they are killing the vegetative weeds that are there before planting. And that's normal practice in a no-till,
With what, pesticide or something?
with a herbicide, with a herbicide.
And after the installation of this system, will those pesticides, herbicides, chemicals that you're talking about, will they continue to be placed on this property?
So the normal practice before a site is placed into operation is soil samples are taken to determine the nutrient needs of the crop. In this case, the crop would be some sort of a hay material. And then that recommendation would be incorporated into the soil, and then the grass, the hay crop, would be planted. Once that hay crop has been planted, it's usually just maintained by harvesting and removal of the hay material. If there starts to be some invasive weeds that encroach upon the property that need to be eradicated, there may be selective herbicides used to address those particular weeds.
I have no further questions for Mr. Valentine.
Let's do board first. Board, if you have any questions, Mr.
Does
Valley?
anybody here have any questions? This far?
Michael Kulik, an alternate on the board. My question is about the purity and clarity of the water being spread there. You know, I tend to think of it like a homeowner, like a drain field. But I don't. You said it's treated, and how clear? I'm sort of rambling on it, you know, around it. Homeowner drain fields, I think, are 10 or 20 years, and then you can expect them to be clogged with the particulates that, you know, render that drain field clogged and useless. Is this the same sort of life expectancy?
Let me ask you a question.
Yes.
Were you here for Mr. Ebert's testimony?
The second.
The first. I was at the first one at the.
You missed the second meeting?
Yes.
Okay.
So.
He testified a lot about that.
He
Yeah.
testified
You can briefly-
extensively
Yeah.
about water quality.
Yes.
Joe, can you answer the question?
Well, I can certainly answer the question with regard to the picture you painted that drain fields clog after 20 years. If the system is properly permitted, installed, and maintained, I'm talking about an on-lot sewage system. That idea that they have a 20-year life is fantasy. Properly installed, maintained, and operated on-lot sewage system should last indefinitely, and indefinitely I'm going to say for the life of the family or house that's there. The reason why systems, as you mentioned, clog up is that a biomat forms. That's a black glue. It's a product of anaerobic digestion in the soil. So once the soil becomes anaerobic, this biomat starts to form. And that's why some of our older septic systems, quote unquote, have this black glue that you mentioned, this biomat. They start to what we call pond because they plug the porosity of the soil and water starts to build up in the aggregate portion of the drain field. And once that happens, that biomat really starts to take off in growth. So it really is a function of a system that's properly, again, I'm talking about an individual system here, that's properly permitted, properly installed, and properly maintained. That biomat should not develop to the point that it's going to create a malfunction. When it does happen, one of those three things was the culprit, or a combination of the three: improper permitting, improper installation, and improper maintenance.
And you don't foresee that situation in this situation because you're purifying the water so well?
This water is highly treated, so this water, as Mr. Ebert had testified to, would be what we call less than 10 parts per million BOD, TSS, and nitrogen. So it doesn't have a lot of the nutrients that microbes want to use. And so the higher the nutrient value to the wastewater, the more biological activity occurs in the soils, and the more biological activity that's occurring in the renovation of that sewage is a greater chance to have this biomat form. coupled with the loading rate. So there's two things. One is the quality of the effluent, and second is the loading rate. As long as the loading rate promotes what we call unsaturated flow through the soil, and it doesn't get saturated, and the effluent is devoid of a lot of nutrients, that biological clogging that you mentioned should not happen.
And you don't foresee particulates, just not bioactive, but just some sort of particulates as fine? Because I just want to note, I went to Delaware Valley College for agronomy. I didn't come out with a degree, however, but I know clay, silt, and sand, the three components of dirt.
Mm-hmm.
And clay
Soil.
being the finest. Sorry, you're the professor. Right?
Soil, yeah.
Soil. So, but if you're putting a lot of any particulates in there, fine as they might be, would those clog?
Well, the particulates that you're talking about, I think, would be stuff that would pass through a treatment plant and through these drip systems have these disc filters, okay, that trap any debris, for lack of a better word, that might escape the treatment plant. And so in the case of drip irrigation, I don't think the issue of, as you put it, finer particulate clogging up the porosity of the soil is going to occur. Thank you.
Anybody else?
I have a question. How would this compare to a city, decent-sized city, where they have the affluent going out into people's yards? Would you say it's equivalent, or I'm looking at the grade of it, is it, you know, the affluent that's going out in this system to the drip irrigation, is that the equivalent to something like that, or no?
Well, I guess I don't quite understand when you say like in
I
a city.
probably don't have it right, I'm trying to get a comparison.
So you're talking like a public sewer situation? Okay.
Yeah,
So
like
in
a public sewerage system, yeah.
So in a public sewer situation, you flush the toilet, obviously, it goes through a collection system and ends up in a treatment plant. Dependent upon the requirement for discharge, which varies from treatment plant to treatment plant, which is monitored. The operator has to fill out daily reports and monthly monitoring reports and submit them to DEP to make sure that that effluent being discharged to that surface water is meeting its 30-day average. I think this is where you're headed with this. The treatment plant proposed by Mr. Ebert on this is a very highly treated effluent, meaning that most treatment plants that are discharged to streams that are not high quality would have a much higher BOD load than what's being proposed here. So the treatment plant being proposed here is very high in treatment. And so there's very little nitrogen being discharged to the system along with BOD and TSS.
The reason I ask is, I know a little bit about it, but Florida, we use that to water our lawns.
So in Pennsylvania, that would be called beneficial use of wastewater or recycling of wastewater. And it is used in Pennsylvania, but a very limited extent, not like Florida or out in California. And so I guess to answer your question, if this project was in Florida, the treatment plant that Mr. Ebert discussed in the past several meetings would be that type of effluent that would be used for beneficial use, probably with some disinfection.
That's why I asked the question, because number one, that effluent comes out, and we call it down there the blue water. You got the drinking water and you got the blue water. The blue water, people wash their cars with it. It goes in sprinkler systems, and when it comes out, it has to go, and I'm good at this because I I replace them if you need me. But you don't have to, because the sprinkler heads, where this water comes out, is so fine that if you got a piece of, I can't even, not even sand, it'll block it. And it doesn't. And like I said, people wash their cars with it, they clean around their house with it, and they will the rest. And the effluent isn't going down, it eventually is, but it's going up in the air, and then it goes down. That's why I asked that question.
You mentioned that your initial tests were of 10 parcels. I'm talking about the very first step.
Yes,
And that 4 of those parcels were in the, what you might call the
the industrial
RPL
zone,
proper in
the
the
industrial
center.
zoned area.
What share of the RPL property do you think that represents? Is it a small fraction of it, a large portion of it? Those 4 parcels that were out there?
Well, if the industrial zoned area is approximately 700 acres,
Yeah.
I would say just, and again, you know, this is based upon my memory, we're probably looking at no more than 100 acres of that 700 acres that was about.
How much?
No more than 100 acres of that 700 acres were evaluated at that time in 2019.
Thank you.
I've got one other thing. It's a thought. I had the opportunity to visit a location in Ocala. And Ocala, if you don't happen to know, is a very big, largest in the country, horse country. Huge, huge horse, multi-million-dollar operation down there with all kinds of things that they have related around horses. They build multi-million-dollar houses around these things. Meaning in general for people who have horses and this and that. And I was going by this one site, and I looked at it, was all grass, you know, but it was, you know, it was fenced off. And I said, geez, I said, what's that? And they said, that's where the effluent that comes from and it distributes it into there. And you know what was in a stone throw of that field? Multi-million-dollar homes. So I don't want to hear this stuff about it affect the home value, because let me tell you what, these aren't $2 million homes. These are like $10 and $15 million homes within a stone throw.
This is a residential water treatment plant in the middle of this.
Right smack there, yes. I can tell you where it's at, I'll give you the location.
I do have one request. This is probably Mr. Ebert's alley. The tubing that you had, are you able to pass that around for the board to see? It might answer some questions. I had some people.
I have some in the truck we can use.
Yeah,
I know they wanted to see it before, and you know, they're talking about the water maybe not being able to pass. I think.
We were gonna make that as an exhibit, right? That is an
I have
exhibit.
photos.
Okay.
What?
Yeah,
Yeah, no, but they actually want to.
That's right.
See it.
this time, if there's a next meeting,
If there's a break, I can bring some in.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions from the board?
Yeah, Joe, can I ask a question? Hydraulic, just clarification again, hydraulic conductivity rate. We measure that in inches per week, basically?
No, we measured it in inches per hour, and then it's translated in for the application rate to inches per week.
Okay, now, the figure of either 5.47 or 2, that's basically per acre, the ability to mitigate the water that's brought in from the drip field, in very unprecise terms.
So it's measuring the ability of that soil to pass water, okay?
Okay.
We measured the hydraulic conductivity in inches per hour, okay? And then we calculations, we convert that to inches per week over an acre, okay? I think I'm answering your
No,
question.
you're answering my question, and I'll end it right here. That figure is the determinant to the size of the area we need to dispose of this water?
Okay, so this is slightly different than a homeowner perk test. A
No, I
homeowner-
understand
A
that.
homeowner perk test sizes your drain field. In these large volume systems, there's a number of factors that are taken into consideration on how large this drip irrigation area can be. One is the soils, my domain, okay, which we have to verify that at least 2 inches a week can be applied. And that's the hydraulic conductivity testing that verified that, yes, even with 10% of the measured value, 5.5 inches a week could be applied, and we're just using 2 inches a week. Then the next step to that is Mr. Clark's gonna testify to, and that's the groundwater mounding. So if we put on X amount of water to this field, okay, and it passes through the soil and encounters the groundwater, a groundwater mound will occur. And that's another model that the hydrogeologists use, and I'm gonna let him talk about that. But that's another concern, because if you raise the groundwater mound to within 4 feet of the ground surface, that is an issue for the land application of wastewater. And so the process that occurred here is the first thing we did is measure the soil capacity. Then Mr. Clark is going to give testimony on the groundwater capacity to assimilate this water. And it was based upon his work that it actually reduced the application rates even further from what we measured.
Thank you.
Just before we start with Cross there, we're just gonna take a 5-minute break. I just have to use the restroom. All right, and I did want to say, we are going till 10 o'clock tonight again, so however far we get, that's as far as we get. So it's now on, I'm not sure if Mr. Blazy or Mr. Cousins wants to go first, but.
Try to stand up here, it might be a little easier to hear me and see me. And then I'll try to make a reference to this, and we'll see if we can show it to everybody, and we'll get to it. And some of these I'm gonna have to jump over, because you've answered a lot of questions. And, I'll probably say to you after, I go back long enough to remember Blade Lockery.
Oh, I did. Glade,
Long ago. And that was-
were you on the record here?
No.
But Glade was the person who gave me my professional membership in PAPS.
Yeah, yeah. Here was,
So I can see you.
oh, so let's go back further then. I guess the,
I want to see it too. So
All right, I'll move myself.
no, let Bob take care of it.
that's good. We'll walk around.
Yeah, we can, if you just identify the map, you can face it to the audience, because we have it.
We have to do it.
This is a question about if he can position where my client's properties are in relation to what he's been discussing. So we're looking at what Mark had handed to us all, I think this is Exhibit A6, which was a clear plastic folder that had the dynamic engineering drawing, which is this drawing. And then we can turn this around. And everybody else. I know, but help me.
SK1.
Yeah, SK1, right.
Joe, why did Matt, is it the Hollander? or Australia- Australia- Oh, I see. There we go. Now you can hear me, is that? Okay, I'll try to speak a little louder. Mr. Valentine, the person in your firm apparently that executed this report is a Matthew Hostrander. Could you explain what he did to prepare this report and what you did?
Certainly. So all the test pit evaluations, the 45 test pit evaluations done with DEP and the SEO, I personally did, and they're reported in there, the profile descriptions. When we went to the hydraulic conductivity test, it takes a number of staff members to run those tests. Matt Hostrander was one of them. Also, our engineer in training, Josh Silberto, helped out with that testing. Matt was running that test. I would come out and make sure they were doing it in the right areas, at the right depths, and the right procedures. So I supervised the actual hydraulic conductivity test. I had asked Matt to write that report, and I then reviewed the report for accuracy and conclusions based upon my knowledge of the site. Not knowing that this would be in a hearing, okay, I probably, in hindsight, might have signed the report myself. But certainly, the information in that report, his calculations and conclusions were all reviewed by me.
And what, tell us just the mechanics of a hydraulic conductivity test. I think I know, but let's hear it from you.
Okay, well, there's a number of different methods to do hydraulic conductivity testing. In fact, just last August at Del Valle, we had a soil physicist from NC State come in and another one from California to talk about various methods of measuring hydraulic conductivity. The testing that was done at this site is one of the methods that DEP prefers. So I'll just speak to that method. That method was based upon the morphology in the test pits to identify the most limiting horizon that the morphology would indicate that would be slow permeability. like a firm consistency in the soil, or some genetic feature that indicates slow permeability. And so as we did the test pits with DEP, we made note that at this test pit, we run the test at, I'm making these up, at 36 inches. At this test pit, the test should be done at 40 inches. They usually like you to have 6 inches into the most limiting horizon to measure the hydraulic conductivity test. So for an example, let's say that the test needed to be, the limiting horizon was at 36 inches. We then would excavate down to 36 inches with a backhoe adjacent to that pit, and then dig a hole, usually with a post hole digger, much like a perk hole, 6 inches into that horizon. Then we would use this pipe, it's usually a 3 or 4 inch diameter pipe, and we would keep it level and bentonite seal the space between the pipe and the perk hole that was dug, the annular space. The purpose of the bentonite seal is to prevent water from leaving that pipe and going horizontally and just forcing the water vertically through this horizon.
Well, why would you go 6 inches into it if you're trying to test the resistance of 6 inches above it that you just removed?
So they want to know the internal hydraulic conductivity of that horizon. So if you did it on top of that horizon, okay, you could have some leakage out the side that wouldn't represent the permeability through that horizon.
But what happens here, if you're within a quarter of an inch of it ending, would that matter and then give you?
No, we know that from the profile description, how thick that horizon is. So we're not excavating it through it or near the bottom of it. We're excavating just into the top of that horizon,
Gotcha.
6 inches.
Okay. You had, you said, I think in a question to one of the board members, that you looked at approximately 100 acres of the 700 I2 and I3 acres. How were those 100 acres selected?
They were given to me by the client to evaluate.
So you don't know whether any of the other 600 acres you weren't given might have also had very good performance ability?
Objection as to relevance. We're not here about whether there are other areas that would be satisfactory. We're here about a special exception to have a drip field on one particular property.
The witness testified as to what he examined and what he did not, and I think it's perfectly fair to ask him where he got the instruction and if he has any insight into the areas he didn't look at.
Well,
It may not be relevant narrowly to the question before the board, but he raised it, and or he was asked about it, so I just would
he
like
was
to know.
asked about the 100 acres, not another 600 acres.
So then of the other 600, you have no particular knowledge?
No, I don't.
Okay. I'm going to identify my clients that are here, and then that's the purpose of these drawings, just to see if we can, between sets of exhibits, figure out where people live in relation to the 22.6 acres you're talking about. My clients are Miss Sharon Duffield, Miss Regina Onifrock, and Mr. Michael Onifrock. Miss Duffield resides at 554 Potomac Street, and Mr. and Mrs. Onifrock reside at 43 Summerfield Drive. And I believe, and if you need to, you're looking at the drawing, I believe there's an attachment here that shows, I believe, the drip field, where it would be the drip field, would be parts of the angle property. And I'm wondering if you have any idea where nearby residents may reside, because all of the discussion has been about testing, as I understand it, on your property or on your client's property. You haven't tested any other properties nearby.
As far as testing for application of wastewater,
Or the likelihood of receiving runoff from that farm property. That's really what I'm concerned about.
well, as far as testing for runoff, I guess the hydraulic conductivity testing that we did And the application rates that are being used for this drip system are so much smaller than what the soil capacity could handle. I would not believe there'd be any runoff from drip irrigation. Because drip irrigation is being placed into the soil as opposed to surface application like a spray irrigation system.
Where, would any of the drip irrigation move horizontally then?
So the
If it
application,
hits the restraining layer, or you?
Wait,
Certainly when it gets-
Objection, one question.
Okay.
at a time.
so as I testified, the main purpose of all this testing is to determine that the use of drip irrigation in this case is going to promote unsaturated flow in soils. So water only moves quote unquote downhill when it's saturated. Under unsaturated flow, water moves from what we call low tension to high tension, or from coarse texture to finer texture. And so the issue with drip irrigation, I shouldn't say the issue, the benefit of drip irrigation is that we're dosing small amounts, usually about 8 inches of water, every 2 feet in this drip irrigation area when the system is running. And so it's micro dosing that effluent over a larger footprint. So I would not expect that there'd be any surface or subsurface impact to neighboring properties from this application. Now, vertically down, straight down, with rainfall and what have you, there could be, and that's how the most models are done, is that there's a vertical flow pattern to the groundwater, and Mr. Clark can talk to those features.
Well, we may discuss that with him. Now, back to the SK1 drawing. So are you aware of where residents may be in relation to the proposed drip irrigation field?
Well, I believe they're on the plan that has the neighboring properties. Is there another exhibit that shows the drip field?
What would that one be? I think these are all your drawings on board, so maybe we can try to pull them out. If we looked at these, would you identify what you think you might include residences?
Well, that one doesn't show the drip field, that's the buildings. Okay, so now I don't know what exhibit this is.
You have things over up here somewhere? I think so, I think.
Okay, so it's exhibit number 10 that we're looking at. And so that particular plan shows the proposed drip irrigation fields, which is based upon different loading rates that were determined by the hydraulic conductivity testing and more appropriately by the morphology of the soil. The buffers here from any outbound, the plan does not show where the houses are. I personally know, having been on the site, where the houses are. And they would be certainly, the most houses are to the east of that site.
Says the board, so this was your A10, is that what you're saying in your booklet?
I don't know. It looks like pick up the photograph. I think it shows the exhibit number there.
Exhibit 10. So what you had is exhibit 10, I think in your booklet is this one, or I'll just. Yes, you do have it. Could you tell us then where the homes are in relation, that you're aware of in relation to the proposed field, and where on A10 the proposed field is located?
What home are you talking about?
I was asking in particular about the Duffield home and the Onafrock property, and I'm going to also ask about the Josu Batista. I apologize, I don't remember which way, I don't remember your wife's name right now. Diane. They live at 904 Potomac. So whether you're aware of where any of those folks live?
No, I do not know where they live.
Okay. And where then on A10, are you aware of other homes being in approximate locations to that drip field?
So as I testified to already, that my recollection of the site is that the majority of residential properties that adjoin this property, this site, the Angle site, are to the east of the drip field.
And where is the proposed drip field then on A10?
It's shown there in colors, the blue, the green, the tan.
And where would the 22.6 acres be of that?
It would encompass all those drip fields.
All of these are part of the 22.6, not the 90 acres or whatever. This is not the entire Angle property then?
That's correct.
All right. And then I believe to the east would be, these are local streets in all likelihood. To the east and that open areas would be residential property.
That's my recollection, yeah.
Okay, well, some of this from here, right? Good.
This is it. This is what
It's a, kind of a small question, but in your report, you identify your report with some nomenclature in the third line. We call it the TMP number D11, I have to get closer to read it, 5-1A.4-4. Just wondering what that nomenclature represents and stands for. It's in your heading.
It's a tax, Doug, it's a tax, it,
Oh, I see.
yeah, it's
It's
a tax
tax map parcel number of the site.
Okay, good, thank you. Is it fair to say that your report was specifically intended to address the PADEP requirements needed to obtain approval for a drip irrigation field?
The standards of DEP certainly were followed, but as I mentioned before, using best management practices, we reduced the loading rate to 2 inches per week.
And is there any requirement from either your own internal practices or imposed or suggested by the Pennsylvania DEP that you assess and investigate likely impacts of either the soil horizons and distribution of treated wastewater to them, or the geologic horizons of neighboring properties?
Well, I can just speak to the soil aspect.
Okay?
And could you repeat your question as it relates to soil?
Well, with regard, you seem to have all the soil work is done on what I'll call RPI-owned property, and in this case, the Angle Farm, which is what we're talking about for this application. Did you test any properties off-site? Correct. Maybe you found no need to, but that's the question.
Again, I think I've given testimony to that this evening, that my original charge was to look at 10 tax parcel numbers and do a preliminary investigation to determine which ones had the best soils for land application and contiguous areas that were suitable for land application. It was based upon that work that the Angle Farm was selected.
Okay. So there's no DEP requirement that you're aware of that you test neighboring properties?
Test neighboring properties for what?
For potential of runoff of your soils, of your drainage moving to them and then through them or over the surface, breaking out on the surface?
Absolutely. That's the purpose of all this testing that we do, is to make sure that there's no impact both on the surface or subsurface within the soil, and Mr. Clark will testify from the geology standpoint that there will be no impacts from this land application to adjoining properties regarding wells and as you mentioned, quote unquote, runoff.
I think your testimony was that there was, you always found there was 20 inches to bedrock, or 20 inches to a seasonal high water table. Where, with your drip irrigation, which is at 8 inches below the surface to begin with, that leaves you another 14 inches to hit, or more, to hit to those. But if the water gets to them, where does it go then?
Okay, so we should, the best way I can answer that is, we should talk about what a seasonal high water table is. And,
Go ahead.
and there's a misconception that we're talking about the water table that your well is located in. These conditions in soil that we commonly call seasonal high water tables are due to slow permeability, water that's moving through the profile, that in the wet time of the year, late winter, early spring, more water is placed on the soil than what could pass through the soil, providing that some horizon becomes saturated. And if that horizon is saturated for probably a period of about 3 weeks, we start to form what we call redox features, indicating seasonal wetness. It is not a water table. It's water still going through the profile, but in the wet times of the year, so slowly that certain zones or horizons are saturated with water. But it's water that's moving through the profile. It's not water coming up from the groundwater up into the soil and down at this location.
Correct, but if it's slowed down from the surface infiltration, hits a clay layer, certainly a rock layer, it starts to move horizontally in another direction. Now, we'll talk to the geologist after we hear his testimony about the implication of the rock layer. But for a clay layer or simply a soil layer with lower permeability, if it gets saturated, isn't there then some horizontal movement? And you've got properties that, to my lay eye, are 50 or 80 feet or 100 feet below the farm. And so wouldn't that move?
Objection, compound question. Please ask one question.
So what is the potential for water moving horizontally at different, you can describe it against different times of the year or water conditions to lower elevations?
I'm just going to speak to the soil system, and you can ask that question of the geologist in the groundwater. But within the soil system, there will not be horizontal flow because of the testing that was performed to determine the hydraulic conductivity, and the loading rates are significantly less than what the hydraulic conductivity would allow. Therefore, we're not going to saturate some horizon, as you mentioned, and get horizontal flow. That's why we do this testing, to assure the fact that the loading rates are less than what the soil can move through the profile without creating horizontal flow.
I want to show you two documents, see if you recognize them, and if you do, whether you used them or your colleagues used them in preparing the report. The first one I would have, I think we're at intervener 2. Is that my designation?
What was the other one?
That book.
Okay.
Is that correct?
Yeah, you have it?
Yes.
No, no. Yeah, this is it too.
I'm sorry?
Rob has something for Martin.
I think that's,
I too.
I too. You talked about the Natural Resources Conservation Service being the former CSS, I guess it was. So it's the National Cooperative Soil Survey, and it looks like it's of the same Engel property that we've been discussing. Is that something you accessed or were aware of during your generation of your report?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we usually look up the mapping of soils before we proceed to investigating the property.
And did you reference this in your report at all?
No.
Okay. Could you tell us, as you look at the colored area, where approximately the 22.6 acres is? Because I think this is a larger section than just 22.6 acres.
I don't know how we're going to do this and have it recorded.
We could draw on it or just measure from the top corner roughly how many inches down, and we'll put that in the record.
I'm going to object to this. It's beyond the scope of his direct examination. He didn't.
He said he considered it when preparing the report. He looked at these documents.
Yeah. And he said that.
And so having said that, could he tell me where on this he believes the 22.6 acres is?
You're asking him to guess.
I mean, to the best of his knowledge, I mean, do you have a pen? Can you mark it?
And why do we have to do this when we have actual maps?
Well, none of them show the homes. This drawing, if you look what I'll call to this lower right side where there's a lot of trees, you see a lot of buildings along that tree line. And I believe that's where a number of these resident properties are that we're concerned about being affected by the drainage.
Why is he obligated to identify your client's property?
Yeah, the identification where the properties are there, they're not.
Okay.
You know, I mean, I think it probably would be best to identify them through your clients or whoever the individuals that
Well,
live there.
we'll try to do that later, but my experts aren't here, and I thought it would be helpful if we could try to find some common agreement. So then I'd like, this one marked as, I guess, I-3. Because if we don't discuss it in detail now, we'll do it later.
I-3?
That's louder than talking. Mr. Valentine, do you recognize this document?
This is a document identified as I-3. It's the Custom Soil Resource Report for Northampton County.
And in the upper left-hand corner, it says United States Department of Agriculture, and then NRCS again, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So it's by them for this section of Northampton County? Is that your understanding?
Yes.
Okay. Did you refer to this or your colleagues in preparing your report?
As I stated before, we evaluate all published information in evaluating any site, including the site I worked on today for an individual on-lot sewage system. It gives me an indication as to what I might encounter. But when you download these web soil survey maps, there's a warning that's given that says on-site investigations are required to determine the accuracy of the map.
Okay. in the investigations that you conducted, did you investigate the soils in the proposed field to determine if they were very clayey soils, resulting in hard pans or limiting zones? Was that part of your investigation?
That is part of our investigation, describing what we call the morphology of the soil, which includes the texture, the structure, and genetic soil features.
And did you find any clay limiting zones in the 22.6 acres that is being used now?
No, we did not.
Did you create or utilize a groundwater mounding model or other calculation related to mounding of water in these pits?
No, I did not. That's the privy of the hydrogeologist.
Okay. Now, when you said the seasonal high water table, I think I understand that concept. You were looking, it had to be less than 20 inches from the surface.
Had to be greater than 20 inches.
Greater, rather, I'm sorry. Right, it had to be deeper than 20 inches.
Right.
Did you find basically where the water was there a water table that you reached other than in the test pit area?
In the test pits we evaluated, there was no free water that was encountered, or as you would say, a water table.
We're talking now about the 22.6 acre
Correct.
Echo property? I think you testified, and I assume it's therefore represents the exclusive group. I think you said for the test pits it was representatives of the PADEP, the sewage enforcement officer of this township, and your own staff. Was anyone else present? Was like your geologist present, or any neighbors or residents? Was anyone else in attendance?
No, there were no others.
Okay. What about other chemicals and elements that were, other than, let me withdraw that and ask a different question. In your report, I believe you said water quality, there were some water samples taken and analysis conducted. What were did you do that, or is that under the purview of the geologist?
That's under the purview of the geologist.
Did you, as a soil scientist, think what I would call agricultural chemicals, and then we'll get to some coal chemicals in a minute, but things like arsenic might be tested for because of the use of arsenical pesticides in days gone by?
We did not evaluate for that, nor did I consider it to be an issue on this property. We have evaluated that on other projects that were in apple orchards known for that sort of contamination. But to my knowledge, there was no orchards on this property.
Did you inquire? How would you make that determination?
Well, first of all,
I mean, go ahead, I'm
by
sorry.
the historical record from the farmer, because we always like to talk to the owner about the prior use of the property. And there was no indication that there had been orchards on this property.
Okay. What about, isn't there a railroad down below, as I recall, near paralleling River Road? Are you familiar with that?
It follows River Road, yes.
Yes. And I assume it's been there when there were still steam locomotives, and so you would have the coal locomotive emissions. So were you looking for any coal-fired emissions?
I objection.
to the ground, which then can be picked up by water.
What's River Road got to do with where this property is?
Well, usually the exhaust from a locomotive goes up in the air and then spreads all around the property that joins it. So just curious whether any coal, and of course there was a coal-fired power plant there, so is there any checking for heavy metals associated with coal in the soil?
We did not do any sampling of the soil for metals.
Oh, there I am, sorry. Can you tell us what the proposed additional daily disposal of approximately, I think Mr. Ebert testified that, and my number's a little off, I think it was planned or designed for like 111,000 gallons per day, but his expected daily treatment and was 101,640 gallons, if I remember correctly. How does that translate into additional inches per year of water being disposed of on this 22-acre parcel?
The question that you're asking me is at the application rate of 101,640 gallons per day.
Right.
Okay. How does that translate into inches
Yeah.
per week? And I have given that testimony already. So
I didn't hear that. I
So
thought you said,
I'll run
was
through,
it 1.2 inches?
I'll run through this one more time. So based upon the hydraulic conductivity testing and measuring, just using 10% of that value, 5.47 inches per week could be applied. That exceeds the best management practices of not exceeding 2 inches per week. Fred Ebert, in design of the system, uses a more thorough investigation using the morphology of the soil. The southeast region of Pennsylvania requires that, and his experience with drip irrigation, as he gave testimony to, makes him more comfortable using that morphology. So based upon the morphology of the soil, which is the depth to bedrock, the depth to seasonal high water table, whether or not we're talking about moderately deep or deep soils, or whether we're talking about well-drained or moderately well-drained soil, there is a factor that is used to assess a loading rate for those various types of soils. The deep, well-drained soils can accept more water, to keep this simply, than soils that are moderately well-drained. An average, and that the exhibit number 10 that you produced during this time shows these various application areas, and the rates are going to vary based upon the morphology of the soil. An average of all those is about 1.2 inches per week.
Okay. Well, I think our numbers are going to match then. So if you measure 1.2 or multiply 1.2 inches per week by 52, you're someplace over 60 inches, is I think my math tells me. About close to 60.5 additional inches of water being deposited on that ground. What would you say the average rainfall deposition is in this area of Pennsylvania?
It was currently 45 and it's increasing.
Okay. So we're more than doubling the amount of water being disposed of on that property, or being received by that property if this application is accepted and installed.
That's a true statement, but the hydraulic conductivity of the site will allow for that.
Okay, well and to the extent there's I'm gonna make a statement of what I believe you're telling me, and if I'm wrong, just you correct me and stop me there. But I think what you're saying is, from a soils perspective, that additional 60.5 inches or 1.2 inches per week is gonna penetrate the soils vertically and get down to the rock structure or impermeable structure, so it becomes the topic or subject for the geologist to discuss.
That is correct.
And when I was asking you about testing for heavy metals, you said you didn't do that, and your report suggests, declares what was tested for. Was that all your judgment, not to test for anything else, or were you given a protocol to follow in that regard?
No, that's not standard procedure in any large volume system that I've worked on in the past 40 years to do chemical or chemistry testing of soils.
Was there what I would call a phase 1 environmental study conducted on this property, to your knowledge?
I have no idea.
Okay. And I take it there, from what you were saying, there's nothing you were told or observed that suggested to you there were hazardous materials likely deposited or present on that property, other than maybe some agricultural pesticides and that type of thing?
That's correct.
Is there anything in your experience that suggests winter application rates need to differ for the deployment of a system such as this from those in the summer?
If you're asking me about operation of drip systems, I think that's a more appropriate question for an operator. I can tell you my experience with research at Del Valle College is that the winter applications, we saw no effective change as far as treatment in the soils. That's because the soil remains biologically active, and the water that's coming from these drip emitters are biologically active to the degree that it keeps the soil from freezing.
So that's what I was thinking about. They talk about a foundation, cross lines, foundations need to be below it and this and that, which is often several feet deep, but you're saying, it could be, it's not an issue here, as far as you're concerned.
As long as it continually operates, and is not shut down for long periods of time, that is correct, the ground won't freeze. And that's been well documented in states like Wisconsin and Minnesota that have drip irrigation.
Okay. And what about heavy rainfall, some of which we've all experienced in the last couple of months? Is there a time when you need to say there's too much water coming from the heavens above and we need to slow down application rates?
And that would be a good question for an operator or a designer.
Okay. I think that is all I have for you. Thank you.
Mr. Cousins?
Yes, I'm done. With this one, and I'd like to just offer exhibits I, 2, and 3 into the record.
I'm going to object on the basis of relevancy.
Well, they'll be relevant later, I think it's our experts may use them, but.
Do you want to wait for your experts?
Well, no, I think it was appropriate, this witness identified them as part of the type of public record document they evaluated, so.
I mean, I think I-2 he did, I'm not sure if he said that he reviewed I-3.
Mr. Valentine, could you say you or your colleagues looked at I-3 in terms of the public documents?
No, I did not. You asked me if I'm familiar with that document. The answer was yes. Our standard practice is to consult the web soil survey for any site that we're evaluating, which you did for your I-2 exhibit.
Okay. Well, this would look to me like the similar drawing on it for the same property, so that's why I thought both would be relevant. I can wait till my witnesses.
I think you have to have your witnesses identify the purpose.
Okay.
I agree with that.
All right. Or you wanna keep them and then just don't move the
Sure.
question later? Or
Sure.
how do you do that?
I don't want you to have to go pick them up.
Thanks. I'll be a little brief. Mr. Valentine, a couple questions. Oh, sorry. No. The 10 sites that you looked at, could you tell us again what it was that you did to examine those sites specifically?
So when we perform preliminary evaluations, we're basically remapping, looking at the soils to determine if the map, the NRCS map, is accurate, or whether the soils actually have better soils capable for land application. Simply put, we were trying to determine where the soils were best suited for land application of wastewater.
Okay, and I think I understood that, but what was it you actually did? Did you
Oh.
dig in the soil?
Yes.
Did you look at it?
Okay.
Yeah.
So we used a backhoe and we dug test pits. And based upon topography and physical features at the site, we would select areas to dig to try to map out the better soils.
Okay, and so you did that for all 10 of the sites that you were presented with, correct?
That's correct.
And where, you mentioned that 4 of them were in what we call the industrial zones, correct?
Mhm.
And the other 6, where were they?
They were in areas that were not in the industrial zone, but all in the general area of the Angle Farm.
Okay, were these properties all owned by the applicant?
I don't know that.
Okay. Can you identify for us where you did where these properties were?
Well, I need a tax map to show you that.
Okay. Can you do it on any of the diagrams that we've used as exhibits?
No, because it's a much more extensive area.
Okay. So as we sit here today, can you tell us in general terms where the other parcels that you looked at were?
Okay, in general, you're talking about the parcels outside the industrial zone?
I'm talking about, I want you to, if you can, identify for us where the 10 parcels were that you looked at.
I'm gonna object as to relevance. We are not here about 10 other parcels.
We're here to
testify to it, I'll overrule it.
Thank you.
So, of the 10 parcels we evaluated, 4 were in the industrial zone area. Those parcels, I would say in general, were to the north of the Angle Farm site naturally, because that's the industrial zone area. And we're in the southern portion of that industrial zone area. The remaining 6 parcels, excluding Angle, were all in general proximity to the Angle Farms. Some of these areas outside the industrial zone area were to the west of the Angle Farm and to the south of the Angle Farm.
And on each of these parcels, how many test pits were dug?
I'd have to consult the field notes on that, but numerous.
Okay. More than 10, less than 10?
But depending on the size of the property, generally we're looking at somewhere between 2 pits per acre. So yes, they were probably, the larger properties had probably in the neighborhood of 30 test pits. The smaller ones might have only had 10 test pits.
And when you dig in these test pits, are you doing the same kind of profile that we see that are attached to your report?
That is correct.
So you're looking at what different profiles, that morphology that you talked about, at different levels going down to that 50 inches or so?
Correct. We're identifying the limiting zones, describing the soils, and using that information to map the soils, to basically create a detailed soil map of where the suitable soils are versus the unsuitable soils.
And when you were doing this, was it at that time you were anticipating a much larger field than was eventually selected?
At the time we did the investigation, the wastewater size was at least 100,000. My recollection, they were looking for more like 200,000 gallons a day.
And then I think you described that was limited down later on in the process, and you came up with this 22 acres, correct?
Correct.
So when you did the test fields, how many of the sites that you identified were not suitable for a drip irrigation field of that size that you were investigating?
Well, none of them were suitable for a continuous acreage to accommodate 100 to 200,000 gallons a day. That's why we selected the Angle Farm, because it had the most contiguous suitable area for land application.
And that had been my question. You didn't say in your prior testimony, and I wanted to clarify, you didn't say there weren't any others, but you're saying that of those 10, the only one that was suitable for the purposes of this particular application was the Angle Farm?
That is correct.
Okay. And again, you don't know how they were selected or whether there were other sites that were potential for this site, correct? Okay. And who provided you this 10 sites?
The developer.
Okay. I just want to go over, attached to your report, right after that third or fourth page where we have the charts and your summaries, you have these site investigation and percolation test reports. I just want to ask a couple sort of questions about that so I understand what this is. And, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay, so is this a report on each of those test sites that you dug on the Angle property?
So if you're addressing what's labeled at the top, site investigation and percolation test report for on-lot sewage,
That's the one. Yep.
okay. So that's a standard state form, commonly called the Appendix A, and the upper half of that form has the soil profile description of that individual test pit. So the first one is test pit number 50.
Right, so you go in, that pit that you described with the slope and the 50 inches go down is dug, and then one of your soil engineers goes out and completes this form.
No,
Basi-
I completed
You
it.
complete it, based upon your observations of the soil.
I
Is that
described
right?
the soils, that's
Okay.
correct.
And then this form, I think it refers in here somewhere to instructions, but you say it's a state form on how to fill it out.
It's a state form that's used for the on-lot sewage program.
Okay. And that is done for each of the test pits that were dug on the Angle property.
That's correct.
And that data was then incorporated into the tables that you provided, that show what the profile would be, correct?
The table was a summary of what the depth of the pit was and the depth to the limit was.
And then I just wanted to close the loop on this, the saturated hydraulic conductivity calculations, that's the test that you described previously, correct?
Correct.
And these forms that are in your report, those are the specific ones for each test that was run?
The individual sheets for each test.
Okay. And then I want to ask you just briefly about your chart that's on the next penultimate page of your report before the signature. There's a number of entries in here that say not encountered, specifically for depth to redox features, depth to rock, depth to groundwater. So you testified earlier that you didn't encounter what we would call groundwater, correct?
Correct.
And so that column reflects that finding by you when you did these test pits, correct?
Correct.
And the same thing with you didn't encounter any bedrock or depth to rock, right?
And those test pits that are listed there,
Right. Were there some others on the Angle property that were not part of this 22 acres that had rock on them?
I'm looking at the preceding chart, which has all the hydraulic conductivity tests.
Right.
And these are just the hydraulic conductivity tests. So there were 28 hydraulic conductivity tests done on the property, 11 of which were utilized for the calculation. That's the second chart.
Right.
Okay? Of the hydraulic conductivity tests, the answer is no, we did not encounter bedrock in any of those test pits. We did not encounter any groundwater in any of those test pits.
And there's the redox features, that you've talked about that a couple of times. It notes at what depth.
I'm sorry, again?
It notes at what depth you would encounter those redox features.
Redox features, that's correct.
All right, I think I understand that. I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
One last question.
Sure.
All right. Were you aware that the angle?
Can you go to the mic, please?
Yeah. This goes back to other contaminant potential. Were you aware that the Angle Farm had been used years ago for sewage sludge? I think the concern was called Synagro at the time.
I was unaware of it at the time of our investigation. I was made aware of it at this last hearing from your questions.
So at the time you were deciding what to test for, you weren't particularly aware of that activity having been conducted on the property?
Well, that's correct, but because of your questioning last hearing, I did contact DEP with regard to the validity of that statement that you made. And I've been told by DEP, and they should, you know, I can just repeat what I was told, I didn't review the file, that this property had a permit for land application of biosolids. There was some litigation. Initially, they wanted to use type B biosolids. The agreement was made that only type A biosolids could be applied. According to the DEP rep that I spoke with, it happened one time in 2017, and type A biosolids are highly treated sludge, as you put it, that has strict requirements on the amount of metals. A real common type A biosolids is Lorganite, which is a bag of fertilizer from the city of Milwaukee that has been marketed. And any individual can go to Lowe's and pick up a bag of Milorganite and put it on your lawn. That is the same material that was applied once, to my understanding from my conversation with DEP on this site.
Thank you.
Who wants to be the first party to ask questions? Or does anybody have any? Sure, Mr. Tripoli.
Yeah, I just have a,
Come up to the mic.
oh, all right. I thought I talked loud enough. All right. I just got a quick question, a clarification. Mr. Ballantyne said that he tested 10 different test sites, 4 of them on the 700 acres. So the other 6 are on the 100 acres? Because you said that you tested west of the 100 acres. So I'm just trying to figure out,
So
where are the 6 test sites, other than the 4 on the developer's property? Where are the other 6? They're not all on Angle's property.
well, that's
are they?
correct. These are all different tax parcel numbers that it,
Oh, but they're all on Angle's property?
no,
They're not?
no.
All
No,
right.
there were other sites that we evaluated that were not in the industrial zoned area. In the industrial zoned area, we looked from a preliminary standpoint at 4 tax parcels. On the non-industrial zoned area, we looked at 6, one of which was the Angle Farm.
So the other 5 were
Around
adjacent
the
properties
Angle Farm.
that belong to other people?
That is correct.
Okay. Because our property is adjacent to Angle's property, but it's across on Potomac. And you didn't dig any holes on our property.
We only dug where we have permission to dig, and certainly my client gave me direction on which parcels to dig.
Okay. That's all I wanted to know, was where these test sites are. Is there a drawing of where these test sites are?
I have field notes with regard to that, yes.
Okay. All right. That's all I wanted to know. Thank you.
Sure, Mr. Clark.
So is the format, address, name and address, Fred Clark?
Frank Clark, you could, yeah.
Okay, fine. All right, I have to recraft some of these things have been asked, and you tell me if you've already answered them, I'll do my best. But this is maybe the simplest one of all. Is this considered an on-lot or off-lot disposal?
This is considered a community sewage disposal system.
So it's neither on-lot or off-lot? Because in the zoning hearing board document that addresses what this is all about, I believe, all right, there was a cross-off of, I think you meant on-lot. So I just didn't know, that was just a out of curiosity. Okay, so it's a community disposal system. You wrote a letter from, or, you know, your company wrote a letter to Fred Ebert, I guess on November 4th, 2022. That's a summary, your summary report of.
That's the report, I believe.
And is that in the binder?
That's in the binder.
Okay. And you did your testing between January 4th, 2021 and January 8th, 2021?
That testing was the hydraulic conductivity testing.
Right, okay. But is that the testing you did?
That's correct.
Okay, yeah. So, have you reviewed any other reports for the property, the general RPL development, subsequent to create, you know, subsequent to doing the testing? In other words, I'll be specific. All right. Did you review the Geotechnology Inc. Stormwater Infiltration Report?
Objection, irrelevant.
I'm trying to.
What's the relevance to it?
Okay, the relevance is there were several reports done that speak about the soils on the RPL, the whole development, Anglefield and just the whole development, and I wanted to.
By who?
The Geotechnology Associates did a report, Value Engineering Inc. did a report. So there were other reports that were submitted along with the PADEP, and I'm just looking for consistency around the reports, and if the reports all agree with each other about the soils on the Angle property to the extent that they speak about them. So I'm just looking for consistency with the reports and whether he has any knowledge of any of the reports. If he has no reason to have any knowledge of the reports, and he didn't study them to compare to his report, because some were produced after his report, some were produced before his report. So I'm just looking to see, we talked about what did you refer to as you did your study, and I'm looking for consistency.
So I will overrule it to the extent that he can ask if he reviewed these reports. If he didn't, he didn't.
Right, that's all I'm asking.
Identify each individual report you're talking about,
okay.
and do it one by one.
Okay, there's only two.
All right.
The Geotechnology Associates, Inc. Stormwater Infiltration Report dated February 28th, 2023. Did you have any cause to review that?
No, but
Okay.
was that report done at the area we investigated?
So
I believe its footprint has, some of the maps actually describe the Angle field. So and it talks about soils. So it's okay. If you didn't review it, you didn't review it. I mean, it's really that simple.
I mean, his report's dated November 4th, 2022. We're talking about a report from 2023.
I'm asking if, in the case of the sludge, when he heard the testimony, he went back and he reviewed what happened. So all I'm saying is, when he finds out, when new information is generated, is he taking a look at it? That's all I'm asking. All right, so if you didn't.
It's gotta be relevant. This is about a different property than is the subject matter, excuse me, the subject matter of this hearing.
I actually have, there are actually maps that include the Angle field on them in these two reports I'm going to refer to.
He testified that he did not review that.
In this one, he did not. Okay, and the other one is the Environmental Impact Assessment Report for River Point Logistics Planned Industrial Report dated September 10th. Now, this is before your report was generated. Dated September 10th, 2021, prepared by Stephen Daddio of Value Engineering, Inc. So all I was trying to get at is, did you use these? Okay,
Ask the question.
okay, did you review that report?
I'm unaware of that report. No.
Okay, all right, it's fine. That's all I was getting to, all right? Did you review any testing of the soils on the Angle property prior to to pick, I'm trying to understand how you picked your samples.
Ask the question.
Yes. Did you review any other tests of the Angle field performed before you did your testing?
The answer is no, and I'm unaware of any prior
Okay,
tests.
that's fine. That's fine. That's all I was getting to. All right, so the report that you generated specifically identifies deep well-drained soils, moderately deep well-drained soils, moderately deep, moderately well-drained soils. The soil classifications they seem to be in a summary table, the best soils for this application. Is that true? Is that a true statement? Those would be the kinds of soils you look for.
As I've given testimony before, my task was to identify soils that were at least moderately deep and moderately well-drained, or better. And so the answer to your question is, yes, that's what I had defined
Okay.
in order to do the
That,
land application.
all right. And that was, they're the best soils for this type of application. Were there any other soil drain classifications found on the Potomac West disposal field? In other words, were there unsuitable soils found in that field?
Well, yes.
Okay, all right. Now, you said you did,
If you're talking about the larger acreage,
I'm talking about, yeah,
yeah,
the large.
the entire
Right, the
tax
entire-
parcel, yes.
Right, the entire tax parcel, there was unsuitable tests on that as well. So you did 45 test pits, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And 11 tests were found to be suitable, is that correct?
No, no. So we did 45 backhoe excavated test pits
Okay,
that were described in the report,
all right,
that were witnessed and evaluated by DEP and the SEO from the township. Those pits were strictly to identify the morphology of the soil.
okay.
28 areas, hydraulic conductivities were conducted adjacent to test pits that were previously evaluated. Of those 28 hydraulic conductivity tests, 11 of those tests resulted in the area that we're doing the land application.
And was it buffer, was it because you needed, some of them were you decided you wanted a bigger buffer around the,
We tested a much larger area, but due to buffer requirements,
Right.
one in particular to wetlands, it encroached upon areas that we had tested.
and some of those tests had to be excluded for that reason?
Correct.
Okay, that's all I was getting. Did you, I think you've answered this, but did you analyze the soil chemistry at all?
No.
Okay, no soil chemistry. All right, I think you've already talked about the sludging. I don't know if you're the right, your soil, is there any way, if the sludging did pollute the field, or if there was any solution, is there any reasonable way to remove that pollution before using for drip irrigation?
Hey, I'm gonna object.
Okay.
That's
all right.
I mean, do you know if,
No,
Are there any
I'm just
contaminants on
trying
the
to
soil?
understand if, there's been no chemical testing to the best of my knowledge, and that being the case.
but you're asking him a question about whether or not he knows if contaminants would do something?
No, I'm asking, is there any way to mitigate contaminants? That's all.
Well, how do you know if they're contaminants to begin with?
Okay, all right, I'll just move on. That's all right, I'll move on. All right, is it fair to say that the increased hydraulic load on the Potomac West disposal field would accelerate the migration of any pollutants already in the field?
Asked and answered at least 4 times.
You're speculating to the extent that there are contaminants.
I'm asking the rate, I'm asking about the rate at which they would move in the presence of more water. Now, I'm not asking about if they're there, I'm not even speculating there. I'm asking, anything that's in that field, a non-pollutant, is it fair to speculate that, or not speculate, is it fair to say that if you put twice as much water in, it'll move through the ground twice as fast? That's all.
To my knowledge of this site, based upon the testing we did, which promotes unsaturated flow, the answer is no.
Okay, all right, thank you. Finally, would you conclude that the property, any property sharing the soil and hydrological characteristics of the Potomac West disposal field would generally be reasonable to use for drip irrigation, barring zoning restrictions or other factors? In other words, is that, I mean, Fred Ebert kind of pointed out that it was
Objection.
optimal.
Please ask the
All right.
question.
All right, I did. Is it the perfect kind of a field, in your estimation?
Your question is this the perfect field?
Is this like about as good as you've ever seen, I guess is, or have you?
Well,
Excuse me. I'm gonna object to the relevance.
All right, I'll let it go then. All right, thank you.
Anyone else with party status, questions? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I have one.
I got two.
Okay, make it quick, I didn't realize this was.
Just
to
name
ask-
again, ma'am.
Laura Walcott. I didn't realize this was to ask questions, so I have all this other stuff I wanted to say. So I just have just a few things really quick.
For this witness?
Well, actually, a little bit for this witness, more for Mr. Ebert. I apologize, I wasn't here last week, or whenever you had the other.
That's not the witness tonight, that's not it. This is the witness.
Let's, if
Okay,
it's a
so if
question
you
that
want,
he can answer
okay,
later.
let me have, I'll just ask the, questions to, the other gentleman. So basically, one of my questions was for Mr. Ebert, but both Mr. Ebert and the other gentleman had admitted that they had picked Summerfield Drive and the surrounding area because the soil was good. Mr. Valentine tonight confirmed that this evening. However, neither provided, I guess, me or testified
Objection.
neither testified whether they took the residents' lives and families into consideration. Mr. Valentine said there shouldn't be any impact. So my question is whether he did any investigation or any research or completed anything that would confirm that he felt that there shouldn't be any impact. That was one of my questions.
I think he's testified.
I think he's testified
So,
to that already.
Mr. Valentine, if you want to,
I don't recall hearing him specifically saying that he did an investigation. I understood about the 45 test kits, the 28 hydraulics, but I specifically didn't receive that he did a test to determine that whatever's going to happen with this drip field would not have any effect on the lives and the health of the family in the surrounding area. If you did, I do apologize. If you can repeat it, it would be helpful. Thank you.
well, the purpose of all this testing, both what was done in the soil and going to be testified by Jeff Clark on the hydrogeologic impacts, is to assure that there is no impact from this land application to the adjoining properties.
Okay. So is there something I can read that what you tested exactly to show whether you did, you said you did this in the past, whether there were other families that lived near a drip field that you put together, and whether there was any research done that there was never a health or any concern regarding a drip field being close to a home? Do you recall?
Well, Mr. Ebert gave testimony to that regard to other projects that he's worked on. All I can speak to is to my experience, and I have never encountered any health effect from either a single-family drip irrigation or a community drip irrigation on neighboring properties.
And then one other quick question I have, and you did talk about this, but I may have missed it. Did you test for any metals, more specifically metals like malignite? It's M-I-L-O-G-A.
We did no chemistry, no sampling of soils for metal chemistries.
Okay, thank you for the time.
okay, thank you, Ms. Walcott. Was there one other person behind the, I couldn't see?
Mr. Engel.
Yeah, Mr. Engel.
Mr. Engel, I am one of the people who actually is a directly adjoining property owner. And my question to Mr. Valentine is in your knowledge, if the drip irrigation field is on 22 acres on a just shy of a 90-acre property, what would the requirement be from DEP to have a setback from the drip irrigation field to an adjoining property?
That's a question really for the design engineer.
It's 50 feet, by the way.
Well, no, it varies, it varies. It varies on a number of issues. So for drip irrigation, I've been involved with projects that have been as close as 25 feet to a property line and as far away as 100 feet to a property line.
So in this particular case, what would the distance be from the edge of the drip irrigation field to any of the properties?
Fred Ebert testified to that. I don't have that firsthand knowledge on the actual design aspect of it.
Okay, I'm not gonna give any testimony, but certainly the distance is greater than the distance required. Greater distance than the distance required. That's why as an adjoining property owner, I have no concern.
You don't live there. Just put it out there.
No.
Ron, let me get to my next witness, please.
Do you want to start? Well,
Can I ask you?
hang on. Go ahead, Adrian.
Mr. Valentine, your testimony about never having any health effects of any of the projects, could you give us an idea how many of these kind of community, what do you call them, community application fields you've worked on?
Well, most of them have been in Bucks County.
Okay.
And many of them are spray irrigation as opposed to drip irrigation. There is one particular township in Bucks County that requires the developer to use spray irrigation. That has gone on since, I'd say, the mid-70s in that particular township called Buckingham Township. I take students on a field trip where we have houses literally directly across the street from the spray field. So, to my knowledge in Bucks County, I have never heard of any public health effect from spray irrigation, and certainly drip irrigation would be a much more conservative approach because you're placing it into the soil as opposed to spraying it on top of the soil.
I appreciate that. So could you give me a number of these kind of projects that you worked on?
I personally,
Yes.
I would say in my career, in the neighborhood of 30.
And how do the ones that you've worked on compare in size and scope to the one that's before this board?
I would say that this particular project at 100,000 gallons a day, give or take, is probably in the medium range.
That's all I have, thank you.
Okay. Anyone else with party status? Mark, we got 15 minutes. You want to start? All right.
Your qualifications.
All right.
Yeah, you know, that's not a bad idea.
Yeah, if you want to do that.
Why don't I do that? Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's qualified, and then we can start right up.
I thank you. You did this one. No, no, okay, where am I?
Raise your hand if you promise to affirm, tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I did. Please state your name and business address for the board.
Jeffrey S. Clark, 3282 Hope Drive, Emmaus, Pennsylvania, Valley Environmental Services, Inc.
I'd like you to look at Exhibit A17 and ask you, is this your CV or resume, and is it an accurate statement of your academic and professional qualifications?
Yes, it is.
Please briefly describe your educational and professional background for the board.
I have a Bachelor of Science degree in Geoscience from Penn State University. I have an MBA, also from Penn State University. I'm a licensed professional geologist in Pennsylvania. I have 40 years of experience conducting hydrogeologic studies.
By whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I am the president and professional geologist for Valley Environmental Services.
Could you explain for the board your duties in your job for Valley Environmental Services?
Certainly, I conduct hydrogeologic studies for community and private water supplies, community and on-lot sewage disposal, and long-term monitoring and reports for the Delaware River Basin Commission permits and dockets. I also conduct carbon studies, sinkholes, that type of issue, location.
So, Jeff, give us a description. It's really beyond your qualification, but give us a description of what you do in a situation like this that Joe has described.
As far as a community disposal system? Well, community disposal system, you're required by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection to prepare a detailed hydrogeologic report describing the disposal and how that affects the environment, the hydrogeologic environment. It starts out with, again, as we've been through before, the engineer looking at areas, determining where they want to put effluent, dispose of effluent, and then the soil scientist evaluates the soil on the site, and once that evaluation is done and they've determined the drainage classification and how much effluent could be put on that site, it's turned over to the hydrogeologist to do an evaluation of how that would affect the groundwater system.
Did you do that in this instance?
Yes.
I'd offer Mr. Clark as an expert in hydrogeology and ask that he be accepted as an expert.
Any questions or objections? No objection?
I just have one question. I may have misunderstood it. You said you're doing work for the Delaware River Basin Commission?
I do reports that are submitted to the Delaware River Basin Commission from clients that contract with me to do those reports.
Oh, so you appear before them as an applicant or some technical?
I have in the past, but for the typical reports that I conduct, they're an annual report based on, for example, a public water supplier pumps a significant amount of water and has a permit or a docket with the DRBC to remove that amount of water. And there are monitoring wells in the area to determine if they're adversely affecting the hydrogeology of the groundwater of the area. And annually, they are required to submit a report to the Delaware River Basin Commission. And I prepare those reports. I conduct the monitoring and prepare the reports.
I have no objection.
Good. No objections from any of the party people granted party status? Okay. You good there?
Yeah.
All right, we're gonna adjourn the meeting there. We're gonna try to figure out a date now, so just hang tight. Is there any dates that don't work for any of you guys?
Could you give me a moment? I have to go get my phone out.
Okay. Okay, okay. Well, we have, she said she had 4 applicants for the regular meeting in May here. For us, separate. So this will be a.
That one actually is the newest one. The older one doesn't have as much.
No, no,
grab it down, grab it.